focus also changes the nature of the work done by the fire brigade itself, by the people inside the fire brigade. Not only are they engaged in delivering their important service of putting out fires, but they're also seeking to induce others to contribute to their ultimate purpose of reducing harm from fires. And so community education staff who go around and do school visits and other things about being careful about fires, technical advice staff who provide a service to building owners and occupiers about various things to do with ensuring the minimisation of damage from fire. They all play a role in contributing to this outcome. So what it means is that the fire brigade staff are in the business not only of delivering services, but also of influence. They're in the business of influence as well as that of production. So how does this relate to the wouldn't it be lovely syndrome I mentioned? Well, it shows that co-production is not just something that it would be nice to have. In fact, it's already happening in the normal functioning of many public services. My own research suggests that most public services entail at least some element of co-production. And I think this resonates with the point that Don Kettle was making about naming a problem that can be confined to one organisation when you start to look at it seriously. So I think, in a sense, co-production is a bit like, was it Molière talking about someone speaking prose all their life without knowing it? In a sense, we've been co-producing all our lives without knowing it. Okay, now, this leads to the next question, which is when should co-production be utilised? And that, of course, raises what I call the exploitation misconception, that co-production is about government getting citizens to shoulder the cost of service delivery. And I think, so the answer to the question of when should we utilise co-production is it all depends. That's the answer I think that we need to give. So on the one hand, co-production is not the answer to all the problems known to humankind. On the other, it's not something to be dismissed out of hand every time it is raised. Instead, whether to utilise co-production depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. So what are these circumstances? Well, the first of them is what I call interdependency, and that's where value cannot be created without some contribution from an external party. It's just not going to happen. The internal process is bound up with the external process, and you can't do it unless there's some external contribution. And so in that situation, the question is not whether to co-produce, but rather how best to utilise the co-production that's already necessary, or how best to think about that. And many agencies have begun to deliberate about that. I think the reforms we've seen in programs for the unemployed with mutual obligation and so on, which I have some troubles in the terms of that obligation, but what they're about is seeking to get the unemployed to do some work, and it's pretty hard for an employment agency to get someone into a job unless the unemployed make themselves job ready by doing training and so on, go out and search for jobs, make a favourable impression on an employer and keep making that impression for at least 3 months so they count in the success story statistics. And we can think of it in all sorts of areas where this is important, in health, child protection, conservation, road safety, you name it. So that's one circumstance. Second circumstance is where the services are substitutable and where value can be achieved by either the organisation or by the external party. They're substitutes for each other. And here the issue is not, here the issue is which party can do it better or cheaper. And by the way, that question is similar to the question we asked when we're deciding to outsource. You know, can it be done better in-house or by an outsourced party? Well, I think we can expand that question to a whole lot of other areas. And here's where the exploitation myth comes in, and where it's also, in my view, refuted. Some advocates of citizen co-production focus on its potential to reduce the size and therefore the costs of government. I think the big society has a whiff of that about it. And that the hope is that will happen by handing over some of the burden to citizens. But the weight of the available research indicates that co-production is better for enhancing value rather than reducing costs. That is, for a given level of costs, you can get a better outcome, or rather than having the same outcome for less cost. So I would argue, and I think the research supports this, is that the exploitation of citizen co-producers doesn't usually work. And this has to do with the nature of the reasons why citizens co-produce, to which we now turn. And this question is, how can co-production be elicited from citizens? Well, this raises what I call the motivation misconception. And there are two distinct schools of thought, in my view, on this, both of them simplistic. One school argues that citizens will only co-produce when it's in their self-interest to do so, to get monetary reward or avoid sanctions. The other school argues that you get citizens to co-produce by appealing to the warm inner glow of their altruism. But my research, and that of others, shows that the reasons why citizens co-produce are more complex than that. And this model spells out the mechanisms. It shows that co-productive behaviours by external parties stem from two factors. One is their willingness to co-produce, but the other is also their ability to do so. And these are in turn prompted, at least partly, by things the organisation does to or for or with them, which I call motivators or facilitators. And these, by the way, can be framed in various ways. I haven't got time to go into the issue of framing, but again, the book Nudge, I think, provides some interesting insights into that. Let's look at motivators and facilitators in turn. Among motivations to co-produce, our willingness to co-produce usually stems from a mixture of motivations, and these can be divided into material and non-material factors. So the motivators of material self-interest are, as we mentioned before, either sanctions, such as punishment, pain, deprivation of liberty, financial loss or whatever, or material rewards, such as money, health or amenity. These are, and I stress, these are very important, but they are not the sole explanation for why people co-produce. And to rely on these alone is to not do this very well. Because also affecting people's propensity to co-produce are non-material motivations, which I divide into intrinsic interest, sense of social belonging or desire to avoid disapproval, and identification with the purpose of the organisation or program, what's sometimes called mission alignment, the external party with what the organisation is seeking to do. And these non-material motivations can't be simply reduced to altruism. I mean, economists I hear sometimes talk, we're either self-interested or altruistic. In fact, I think that's a simplistic account, because these motivations are a little more complex than that. So you can imagine a mission alignment might be that someone joins the military because of national pride. Now, national pride can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing depending on how it's used. But it is a normative or larger motivation than our own self-interest. And I think the research evidence I've been able to see shows that people's propensity to enlist in the military is partly a function of how justifiable they think the war is that they're enlisting to go and fight. And I won't say anything more than that. So these non-material motivations interact with material self-interest in various ways to encourage, if not to coerce or manipulate, people to co-produce. But people's propensity to co-produce is not simply a matter of their willingness, but also their ability to do so. They may want to help, but they find it hard to do so. And I think that where you've got people feeling not up to the task, there's two things you can do. You can either change the task or change the people. Changing the task is where you basically simplify it in one way or another. Examples of this might be 000 numbers. It's easier to dial that than some complicated multi-number phone number. The pre-printing of forms when you have to send something back into government, online payment of motor registration, and I'm sure you can think of many other examples. The assistance task, making the citizen more capable of doing the task, some examples might be fire drills or job search training, and I'm sure you could think of other ones as well. So these various ways of eliciting co-production from citizens can only work if they amount to value-creating social exchanges. In the private sector, the market exchange is based on the idea that each party gains more than they lose. And that's into the value-creating economic exchange. But here we're talking about social exchanges in which the government receives co-productive effort by citizens and the citizen receives some mix of material and non-material rewards. In this exchange, both parties must get more than they give. And I say this as a social rather than an economic exchange because it involves diffuse and deferred dealings among multiple parties, not immediate quid pro quo transactions among buyers and sellers. And those of you who've read the literature on social exchange or Robert Titmus's book, The Gift Relationship, will see some insight into this. And the private sector uses social exchange too, where they're seeking to create image over time and hopefully generate a positive disposition. And I think that that's something that we can learn more from. So in short, what I'm saying is that citizen co-producers are not Pavlovian respondents to carrots and sticks. If they're willing to contribute time and effort to organisational purposes, they do so for their own good reasons, which are only partially influenced by the motivators and facilitators that are offered by government. So in conclusion, co-production is not just a nice idea. It's already here. It's embedded in public activities that we're already involved in. And the question is how we can make the best of it, not whether we should do it or not. Secondly, co-production is not about getting citizens to do work that should be done by government. Thirdly, whether to use co-production all depends on the circumstances. And finally, citizens produce for their own good reasons, which we can only partially influence. In closing, you might want to, if you want to pursue this further, there are some books that you can look at. Here are two that I've chosen entirely randomly from the literature, which you may want to look at further. So thank you very much for your attention.
John, we all may remember the co-production efforts by the previous government, and we all received, after 9/11, we received stickers for on the fridge to bring in if we saw terrorist activities. Some of us even received backpacks from the government with helmets and who knows what. So when is co-production effective as a tool for government? Because I can see the value in the fire truck example, but I can also see lots of useless examples where, as citizens, we really question the motives of government to get us to do certain things.
Yeah, and I think that goes with my point that it all depends on the circumstances. So there's no neat, just as Don Kettle was saying, there's no one big idea. I think there's no neat all-purpose, solution bound up in co-production. That you need to actually look at the circumstances. And that's a matter of specifically analysing the context in each. But basically, if there is more value coming from people doing things to the public domain, and those individuals who are doing those things are themselves gaining more value, then we've got a worthwhile endeavour. But often, yeah, it's paralleling what I think is a lot of ill thought out, maybe unnecessary and not particularly well directed consultation and participation in decision making by citizens, where governments have orchestrated this for cosmetic purposes or other reasons. Just as there is that, I think there also can be not well thought out, going through the motions kind of co-production.
John, it's May Lamb from Jobs Australia. Thank you very much. That was most rich and inspiring. I'm very interested to know how you would consider going about redesigning or rethinking the employment services system based on what you've told us this morning.
Right. Well, you notice that diagram where I had all those boxes and arrows. That actually is an example of what's known variously as backward mapping or causal mapping, which I think is actually a very useful device. And I recommend that if you're interested in pursuing the notion of co-production further, it would be worthwhile to take your program or branch or whatever and do that kind of analysis. And that's where you start with thinking about the ultimate outcome, and in fact you go right to the ultimate outcome. It's a bit like the way you do that, it's a bit like when you've got a kid pestering a parent and they're saying, but why? And the parent says, so-and-so. But why? Because so-and-so. And when you get to the point where you say, I don't know, ask your father, that's when you know you've got to an ultimate outcome. And then once you've done that, to then trace a core production process you know, what's happening inside the organisation that leads to this, but then who outside contributes to that corporate